Hello, my name is Patty Berg-Poppy. I'm a pediatric physical therapist with experience in outpatient, inpatient, school, and home-based aquatic environments. In 2009, I received recognition by the American Board of Physical Therapy Specialists as a neurologic clinical specialist. I've been a faculty member within the University of South Dakota Physical Therapy program for about 10 years. My major teaching responsibilities include a neuromuscular course with content including typical infant and child development, motor control, and motor learning, and the program's pediatric physical therapy course. My objectives for this presentation are to help you better understand what postural control is and what mechanisms underlie postural control, to share with you which of these mechanisms might be impacted by a diagnosis of Down syndrome, to provide you with information about how early intervention for postural control might influence postural control, and to give you some treatment strategies for infants learning to sit in order to draw on for postural control motor competencies. So what is postural control? Postural control is a complex process that integrates cognitive, motor, and sensory systems to produce upright postures. Sometimes you'll see postural control equated with the term balance. In order to move, we need a fixed, stable posture to move upon. In this way, postural control in all developmental positions becomes an essential accomplishment for the infant or the child who's trying to, for instance, shift weight to creep across the floor, to accurately reach for a toy, or to move from a short to a tall kneeling position. Each developmental position, such as lying on the back of the tummy, maintaining a hands and knees position, sitting or standing, requires re-education about how to contend with destabilizing forces that influence postural control. Competence in each of these developmental positions helps to construct a motor repertoire for the infant to draw from. For this reason, accomplishments in standing and walking rely very heavily upon early acquisition of stable postures in developmentally less mature positions. So what systems contribute to postural control? As mentioned, postural control is a complex process involving several systems. To simplify a bit, we'll look specifically at 4 of these contributing systems: reflexes, central cognitive and perceptual systems, sensory systems, and motor systems. Each of these systems is highly influenced by maturational processes of the brain, such as the disappearance of primitive reflexes, the development of particular brain centers like the cerebellum, the unification of sensory information, and the development of myelination, development and myelination of specific brain tracts. The first of these contributors is reflexes and reactions. Consider what would happen if the person you're sitting next to were to catch you by surprise and push you in any direction. Likely, you would recover your balance by shifting your body back in the direction from which you were pushed. This reaction requires no thought. It's an established pattern of muscle activation or synergies that emerged with development and were solidified through many, many similar perturbations over time. We also use synergies when we expect something to happen. These are called anticipatory adjustments, and we use them in advance of when we anticipate or expect something that will destabilize us. For instance, when you reach for something, you fire muscles in either your back or your stomach, depending on if you're reaching forward or backward, how high, any of these variables. The strategy allows you to keep your balance. So when our righting and equilibrium responses are not successful, or when the force and the speed of a perturbation are simply too great, we'll catch ourselves with a step or with an outstretched arm. Our earliest experience with these reactions are head righting reactions. As development continues, we use protective reactions until we're competent with equilibrium responses. Anticipatory responses are the last to emerge, and since they rely very heavily upon experience with motor successes and failures. These responses are also the most efficient and the least likely to lead to destabilization. The central nervous system plays a large role in successful management of postural control. Some of the important contributors here include neural pathways that contribute to underlying tone, muscle tone, areas of the brain responsible for integrating sensory information to deliver perceptual interpretations of that information, attention, judgment, memory, and cognition. Postural control relies specifically upon three very important sensory systems: vision, vestibular, which is an apparatus within the inner ear that orients the head in relation to gravity, and somatosensation, which includes body position sense, tactile, and kinesthetic information. On its own, the somatosensory system cannot distinguish a surface tilt from a body tilt. On its own, the visual system cannot discriminate between movement of the body and movement of the environment. And on its own, the vestibular system cannot tell if the head movement in space is the result of neck, trunk, or hip motion. For this reason, information from each of these three systems is delivered to multimodal centers of the brain, where the information is integrated and brought to a level of agreement. When there's conflict, the brain needs to work to resolve discrepancies. These more complex processes are beyond the scope of this discussion. Finally, postural control relies upon several motor system attributes. A first example includes motor adjustment. Information delivered from central feedback to the effector or the muscle systems must allow for error adjustments in response to, for instance, overcorrection, too much force, too much velocity, inaccurate direction, etc. Joint range of motion plays a large role in maintaining adequate postural control, as do muscle strength and muscle tone. Endurance plays a role in postural control, as many children with low tone also demonstrate low endurance and show difficulty maintaining any anti-gravity position for very long. Finally, biomechanical relationships such as alignment of body segments and posture can impact postural control as well. So how does a diagnosis of Down syndrome impact body systems that contribute to postural control? Automatic postural responses emerge as obligatory primitive reflex disappear. An example of a primitive reflex retained longer than typical in infants with a diagnosis of Down syndrome includes the Moro reflex, which results in a quick spreading of the arms followed by a quick recoil of the arms as a response to a quick destabilizing force, usually for a baby. The way that we test the Moro reflex is to hold the baby in this position and move the body and the baby in a downward position, and we see the arms come out and then reflexively come back in. The retention of such primitive reflexes may delay the acquisition of more voluntary control for those with Down syndrome. Infants with a diagnosis of Down syndrome show delays in the development of head righting, protective reactions, midline behaviors, and vertical postures, all of which contribute to effective postural control. The delayed emergence of these behaviors might be traced back to poorer head control due to poor early postural tone. Infants with Down syndrome are more likely to rely upon less efficient and more variable protective responses. The emergence of equilibrium responses in developmental positions is delayed for developmental positions, and the infant is more likely to heavily rely upon protective responses, which are less efficient. In terms of neurological development, young children with a diagnosis of Down syndrome experience several differences that may have an impact on postural control. There's evidence that changes in the brain size are increasingly evident at 6 months of age. This is a pivotal age for developmental shifts, and these neurological differences express themselves as more profound developmental motor delays at roughly this age. In particular, the cerebellum is underdeveloped, and skills founded in the cerebellum's role in setting postural tone, coordinating movement functions, and learning new tasks are compromised. In addition, research has shown that motor performance is more than simply problems with biomechanics. Psychomotor delays may lead to poorer movement activity or accuracy and quality as well, and poorer attention and engagement likely contribute to differences in stabilization and movement quality as well. Sensory system differences for those with a diagnosis of Down syndrome include potential ophthalmologic problems that might affect perception and deficits that might impact motor planning, such as visual spatial, visual memory, and visual sequencing problems. I've found no specific evidence related to deficits with the vestibular system, though there may be some predisposition to inner ear problems. Infants and children with Down syndrome show challenges with processing and modulating sensory information. There's a tendency for these little ones, because of the characteristic low tone, to demonstrate weakness and relatively poor endurance. They generally seek sensation since they're under-registering the sensory information that they're receiving from their body systems. These challenges have been known to manifest as balance deficits for adolescents with Down syndrome. We might extend these findings from adolescence to draw some assumptions across the lifespan, including for those in infancy. Some characteristics that most infants and children with Down syndrome share are passive stiffness around the motion joints, often also referred to as ligamentous laxity, low tone, muscle weakness, and low energy levels. And often as a result of these previous qualities, delays in achieving fine and gross motor milestones. The impact of low muscle tone, muscle weakness, and joint laxity have on movement stability is depicted here in this flow chart. You can see the results are joint instability, slower reaction times, and slower responses to incoming sensory feedback information. As a result of slower responses to feedback, the child's movements are not directed quickly enough to achieve good accuracy, and the result is poor coordination. The child develops some compensatory strategies to sort of deal with the instability by increasing joint stiffness and calling into action the muscles on both sides of a joint. We call this co-contraction. It's a strategy used by many of us when we're learning a new skill and when we want to control from many joints at once. It's also a very inefficient way to accomplish a motor task, and quality of movement is generally compromised since movement is less fluid and adaptable to environmental circumstances. A second strategy is to widen the base of support. Unfortunately, wide stance restricts movement experiences, which are important for learning how to anticipate stabilizing and destabilization, and for being able to adjust to new environmental predicaments. In short, while these compensatory movement strategies help the child with low tone and joint laxity increase stiffness and force at the joints, the movement solutions intended to overcome equilibrium insecurities further inhibit development of postural strategies that are both more effective and efficient. So what does research about postural control interventions in children with diagnosis of Down syndrome tell us? A natural question, given our understanding of the differences in cognitive, motor, and sensory systems with which many infants and children with Down syndrome present, is, Do interventions meant to improve postural control work? Research tells us that early intervention works to facilitate the acquisition of developmental skills in general. We also know that training increases the likelihood that functionally appropriate muscles will be activated as synergistic postural responses. These are encouraging findings given the importance of postural stability as a building block for developmental motor milestones. We know as well that therapeutic coaching works. An important point to make is that motor learning will only be achieved if the infant or the child solves motor problems independently. Anything done for the child will have little impact. In this sense, the therapist and the parent are coaching the child by setting up environmental challenges that evoke the changes and responses that you're looking for. For instance, placing the baby on surfaces that are subtly but increasingly tilted. Strategically placing toys to encourage the infant to stabilize before reaching in order to maintain equilibrium and slowly increase the challenge level. Or using a therapy ball or a bolster to create equilibrium challenges. One of the most important findings from several sources is the importance of parental commitment as a key to enhancing a child's developmental acquisitions. The physical therapist frequency and duration is inadequate to expect significant improvements. A therapist present, for instance, for an hour and a half during the week is absent for 82 and a half waking hours of that baby's life. The greater likelihood is that the parent or the caretaker is present for the greater majority of this time. So motor learning is the consequence of thousands of repetitions. Successful change will happen when play scenarios and well-considered intervention strategies are placed in the hands of parents and caregivers by therapists. Committed families are likely to see the greatest gains. At the very least, we know that enriched environments with exposure to a broad variety of experiences, such as toy textures, different weighted toys, different surfaces to move on, human touch with squeeze and lots of input, large amounts of floor time and limited time in seats and equipment, will help infants and children with Down syndrome develop a larger array of solutions for their movement problems. A couple of interesting approaches which seem to suggest promise for improving postural control for children with Down syndrome include hippotherapy, which is a horse riding therapy, and whole body vibration. Small sample sizes and the fact that these are single studies suggest that we might use caution when generalizing these findings to a broader population. So what can we do to enhance postural control for children with a diagnosis of Down syndrome? In spite of the differences in systems that many children with Down syndrome express, it's reassuring to know that all children with a diagnosis of Down syndrome will move through their developmental milestones, albeit likely with some degree of delay. We can acknowledge that a diagnosis of Down syndrome expresses itself with phenotypic characteristics such as low tone, ligamentous laxity, differences in brain structure, cognitive functions, and sensory processing and modulation, all of which are beyond our ability to change. But learning achievement occurs where characteristics of the individual, the task, and the environment come together. While we have no control over individual inheritance of genetic material, what we do have control over is the very large influence of experience. We can accept that our infant's brain is primed and highly sensitized for learning specific movement, language, symbols, emotional control, and social skills at different periods during development. Learning during these important periods only occurs when that learning is met with those experiences or the priming of that brain is met with enriching challenges and opportunities to practice, fail, remediate, and do the same thing many hundreds of times over and over and over. What are some of the variables that we can alter to create enriched environments that promote postural control competence? Consider, when you place a baby in a prone or tummy lying position, what is your baby learning about gravity? How is that different than if the baby is lying on his back and wanting to play with a toy overhead or off to the side? What is baby learning when he's safely placed on an unstable surface while sitting? What kinds of responses are you teaching baby? Babies are little physicists. Do you think that you always knew that an object growing larger is one that's approaching you? Have you forgotten that when you are in motion, moving forward, objects in your visual field move behind you? When did you first understand that shiny objects are often slippery? It's only through many varied experiences, exposures, and by interacting in our environments that we can be successful in stabilizing for anticipated movement. So then, what can we do to promote motor learning for postural control? In the next few slides, I'll provide ideas that address these 5 points. Specifically, because there is so much developmental work to be accomplished before infants are ready to rise to their feet and stand or walk, I will provide suggestions to promote postural control in sitting. First, infants should be provided with rich and developmentally appropriate play experiences very early in their development. Early exposure to perceptual motor problems will encourage early solution finding. As frequently as possible, parents or family members should engage the child or the infant in play that improves the infant's attention. Parents can use social referencing, such as pointing at objects, using eye gaze for joint attention, to promote attention. Work from providing the infant with a fair amount of support in sitting and prompting the infant to reach for toys a short distance away, and then at an increasingly greater distance. Begin with the objects in front, then at the infant's sides, and finally in the extreme periphery. Offer less and less support, pulling back on the task challenge again until the infant is more independently able to achieve a degree of stability. Use the environment to create motor challenges that the infant will ultimately solve independently, and provide lots and lots of practice. There are some techniques that can influence tone patterns, though they can't change the tone itself. These techniques are especially helpful when you're readying the infant for your session. Often when the infant is sitting upright without using the arms for support, you'll observe the infant dropping back onto the sacral area, fixed with a posterior pelvic tilt. A gentle amount of pressure along the long muscles of the lower back is likely to promote an upright postural response. Another approach for achieving upright sitting posture is to place the infant well supported and seated on a therapy ball. Move the ball forward until the infant responds by activating the back muscles. You can ready the infant for your therapy session as well by bouncing the infant gently on a ball. Always use caution with too much quick movement, given atlantoaxial instability in the neck. You can help build muscle endurance and address underlying weakness by placing the infant in anti-gravity positions that challenge neck, shoulder, and trunk muscles especially. Using lifting, providing opportunities for the baby or the infant to lift, push, and pull will also help with strengthening. You can support postural stability and train equilibrium by, again, setting up motor challenges and progressively releasing your support for the infant while he is sitting. You can also use facilitation to gain the responses you're looking for. The infant in this photo is encouraged to bear weight through the upper extremity. A towel is used to help with shorter arms so that the child can be closer, so that the towel can be placed a little bit closer. Quick movements onto the arm will help train protective reactions to the side. You can provide this stimulus and facilitation in all directions. Reserve the backward direction protective responses for more mature development, since these reactions emerge last. Here you see more examples of handling and facilitation to evoke desired responses. The therapist in photo A has placed the infant over her leg and places the infant's hands on the therapy ball. Placing pressure through the hands will provide tactile information for the infant. The therapist is placing gentle pressure with both hands on the baby's trunk to promote trunk extension, as mentioned earlier, as a tactic to normalize tone. As an extension of this activity, the therapist may roll the ball forward to achieve a response through the core, stimulating forward reach while seated. In photo B, the therapist shifts the baby's weight to the side while she leans backwards. She uses her own hands to elongate the baby's side, using her thumbs and the heels of her hands. Keep in mind, when the baby is destabilized in the direction toward her, the baby's response should be to elongate and move in a direction that is away from her in order to reorient the weight to more toward the center of gravity. In each case, you're looking for a response that includes righting of the head, the trunk, and the neck in the direction back toward midline. Photos C and D depict the different approaches to facilitating diagonal weight shifts in sitting. When a destabilizing force occurs in a diagonal plane, the response is the opposite diagonal plane. If you push your neighbor onto the left hip, the response by your neighbor will be activation of the abdominal oblique muscles on the opposite side. So a movement back onto this hip is met with a response in this direction. C1 begins with therapist kneeling behind the baby, placing both hands along the trunk and aligning the trunk and the pelvis in neutral. And that isn't actually seen in this picture, we're just seeing the response. So the therapist moves the baby's weight onto the left hip and simultaneously guides the trunk to rotate to the right. At the same time, the unweighted leg naturally flexes, abducts, and externally rotates. C2 shows this facilitation on the opposite side. Photo D demonstrates the use of a board or other moving surface. The surface is tilted and altered to provoke postural equilibrium responses to the child. A tilt this direction, you get a response in this direction. Photo E demonstrates rotation of the pelvis. When baby rotates to one side, weight shifts to the same side. The baby sits on the therapist's leg. The therapist assists with weight shift and simultaneous rotation. Mastery of this skill will become pivotal as the baby shows initiative to transition from sitting to moving into hands and knees position. These techniques are, again, a good way to initiate movement. Ultimately, the therapist will need to back away from handling to encourage the infant to achieve these responses independently. Parents should be taught these techniques for carryover in the home. Infants and children achieve anticipatory postural control after they are somewhat accomplished with reactive equilibrium responses. in a particular developmental position. For instance, before a baby will master stability or stabilizing the trunk, before a baby will master stabilizing the trunk before reaching, the baby needs to learn how to stabilize in response to perturbation. You can train anticipatory postural control by exposing many infants to many different object sizes, weights, and textures. You should change the orientation of objects, the heights at which they're presented, the position in relation to the body, these types of things. Infants with Down syndrome will need many more repetitions than typically developing children in order to solidify the information into motor plans. Given that infants with Down syndrome generally under-register sensory information, begin providing infants sensory input from their first day. Hold the baby close. Bring baby's hands together so that they're touching one another. Stroke baby's face with baby's own hands. Touch his feet together. Let him begin to understand what is his body in contact with itself and contact with the world or its caretaker feels like. Sing to baby, talk to baby, rock baby gently in all directions. As baby grows, create sensory-rich environments that are not overstimulating but provide learning opportunities that motivate movement. Apply deep pressure and approximation at the joints to help baby better feel joint receptors and understand where the body is in space. Because many babies with Down syndrome are later to experience self-initiated movement, provide movement opportunities for baby to help develop his sensory system. Try to accomplish this without the use of equipment such as swings or bouncy seats. In summary, postural control is a foundational accomplishment underlying the acquisition of most motor milestones. Children with Down syndrome show delays that may be linked back to poorly developed postural control. Intervention strategies that challenge postural control and independent problem solving will result in motor learning. Parental involvement is an essential piece of programming that will lead to the most favorable motor gains. I look forward to your questions.